Welcome. Today I'll be analyzing Heroes of Might and Magic 5 as part of my tradition of reviewing one Heroes of Might and Magic title per year. This was the first title to not be made by the originating studio, and because of this change of ownership, it is also a title that does not have the best of reputations with most of the Heroes playing community, me included. However, replaying it now changed my opinion of it. Heroes 5 makes it clear from the menu screen that this is a fully 3D experience. This jarring visual separation from its predecessors works as the first hint of what Heroes 5 tries to do. As the name implies, it is the fifth entry in a highly popular gaming series, and this means that it needs to balance the new with that which is expected of the series overall. But how well they succeeded, or if they succeeded at all, that's a matter of discussion. I remember at the time thinking that the art style got wowified, and you couldn't really blame me, seeing as how WoW was influencing most mainstream fantasy video games at the time. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, I can also see that might not have been the sole inspiration, because the art direction seems to me to be considerably more inspired by Warhammer Fantasy, with maybe a bit of manga thrown in there. From the sometimes oversized weapons, the use of the 8-pointed star adorning the Inferno faction, basically all the Necromancer units, as well as the large number of trinkets on the various models, not to mention the entire vibe of the game, to me is much more reminiscent of Warhammer as opposed to Warcraft. But then again, that's funny and kind of feedback loopy because Warcraft was initially supposed to be a Warhammer game. Even though the models themselves aren't extremely detailed, I kinda like that. In general, I am a fan of minimalist design, and while this isn't an example of that, it's just an artifact of its time, I feel they work well. Likewise, the various creature animations are pretty damn nice. They move, attack, and get hit in fairly natural ways, and the death animations are generally very evocative, especially the death animation of the Vampire Lords. The full 3D engine allows for some extra visual features to be put in the game. During combat, you now have a cinematic camera that will trigger at what seems to be random actions, showing you what's happening from very different angles and making the experience a little bit more, well, cinematic. Now, when I played it initially at release, the cinematic camera got really old really fast, and I think that was the case for everyone else back then. However, playing the game now, I noticed that the cinematic camera is really great for streaming, because it breaks the monotony of a tactical screen and helps keep things fresh and moving from a visual standpoint. It's like having the ability to live edit your stream. So this is an unexpected bonus from a superfluous feature, to say the least, initially, which became kinda useful many years later in a very particular application. Also, you can always turn it off. Another thing the engine allows for is having a full 360 control over the camera, as well as allowing you to zoom in and out to a degree. But there's also an option in the game that will sort of flatten things out a bit so as to make the map more similar to the preceding titles. It's obviously not the same, but it is a nice to have option. Going with the entire new engine, new me vibe of the game, Heroes 5 is where the radial buttons show up for the first time in the lower right corner of the screen. To be honest, this isn't that big of a departure from the traditional right hand side column interface from the older titles. It's something they most likely needed from a general design perspective, seeing as how the 3D maps aren't as populated with stuff as their 2D predecessors are, so you need to see as much of the map as possible. Because in all honesty, most of the utility from the side column is now moved to the bottom of the screen. The city screens made the transfer to the full 3D engine with a fair bit of success. For the first time, you get to see a less cluttered and relatively more realistic eagle eye view of your cities. The models aren't terribly detailed, but then again, they didn't really need to be at the time. The majority of what they had to do is to impart a sense of size and scale, and I believe they managed that quite well. The story is where Heroes 5 engages in its first faux pas towards the Heroes of Might and Magic community. Alongside the new engine, the new ownership from fuck Ubisoft, and being made by a completely different studio, because as I've mentioned in my Heroes 4 video, Heroes 4 was released in March-April of 2002, with a large number of New World Computing employees being fired on the 15th of April 2002 for 3DO to then file for bankruptcy in 2003. Heroes 5 also features a completely different storyline from the previous titles. There's nothing that connects it story-wise to anything from the previous 4 titles. The campaign takes place in a completely new world called Ashan, which features similar factions to those from the older games but with various differences. This is where I can understand why a large chunk of the Heroes playing community was disbanded, because up until that point, the Hero series shared the world with the Might and Magic series, and those who played both had a much deeper understanding and appreciation of the world. Me, on the other hand, I only ever played the Heroes titles, and I never really got into their stories at all. I always played the games for their strategy and turn-based tactics aspects. This is why I made it a special point to mention in my Heroes 4 video that it was the only one that actually got me interested in its story. So for me, the setting story reboot didn't matter one bit. As far as the Heroes 5 story campaign goes, it's a fairly by the numbers sort of medieval story. There's talk about honor, ludicrous love gestures, betrayals, bamboozles, villainous machinations, and last-ditch efforts to thwart the inevitable coming of a
demon messiah.
So while the writing is fairly basic, I have to hand it to whoever wrote it because I think they channeled their inner teenager. And that's not a compliment, especially during the Inferno campaign.
Petulant florists, flower sniffer, tree-shagging pixies.
Feel that edge.
How do you do, fellow kids?
Lovely bit of booty, that Freda.
I take that back, an actual teenager wrote this. The menu screen music is highly sweeping and epic. It is a tiny bit reminiscent of the Conan the Barbarian soundtrack if you listen closely. Each faction has its own thematic overall music, and there are a couple of pieces that run during combat, but it seems that they didn't make one for each faction. As such, sooner or later you'll get annoyed because they become super repetitive the more you get into fights. I wish there was a toggle that would allow you to just turn off the combat music, not just the global volume. The Necromancer music deserves special mention here, because to me it sounds like a sped up Jaws theme with some horns put into it for added epicness. Up until now, the game is doing objectively pretty well. It looks good, sounds good, the story is nothing to write home about, but what can you do? But the Heroes titles were never really about any of those things. They were always about their gameplay. So how does Heroes 5 play? It's not really bad for what it is. The problem is that it stands in the shadow of Heroes 3. The resource and creature management part of the game is pretty much a new implementation of the traditional systems. Each faction has a more diverse set of buildings, and there are now level of development requirements for some buildings to become available. For instance, you don't have to build a blacksmith, a mage guild level 1 and a marketplace to upgrade your central building. In Heroes 5, you just need to build a certain number of things till you reach the required level. Creatures are again on a firmly weekly schedule, all of them spawning at the beginning of each week. Pretty much all of them have special abilities which can be directly triggered or passive, only activating when particular requirements are met. This is true especially for the upgraded units, so I suggest reading the creature descriptions in order to understand how to best use your troops. Some of the upgraded troops gain access to special abilities or become capable of even casting spells, so this helps to give them a little bit more in-world character and versatility on the field of combat. Maps aren't as busy as they were in previous titles, and that is something that can be seen as a minus by most, I think. However, the 3D engine possibly came with various limitations and a new design approach, so I don't know how much more there could have been done. The maps themselves look good, they feature a variety of diverse environments as well as the odd Easter egg here and there, like this real world tank, as well as the occasional glitch like this treasure chest that is behind the wall. Okay, so up until now it sounds pretty Heroes-y. What's the combat like? The heroes are back to their traditional pre-Heroes 4 overview position from behind the troop lines, and are still capable of slinging spells. However, they may replace spell casting with using their class specific abilities. These work like spells but don't cost mana. Also, each hero has the option of using their turn to directly damage the enemies by using their class. For knights it's what I call a ride by swording, for magic users it's a bolt of magic, for the elves it's a magic arrow, you get the picture. During combat, you now see the order of actions on the bottom of the screen, allowing you to better time your attacks. But this is where we have to address what in my opinion is by far the most serious faux pas Heroes 5 makes. The stickiest of sticking points. It switched the combat grid from a hex grid to a square grid. I gotta be honest, this was the hardest one to go with because I just did not understand why. So allow me to take some time and let's discuss this in some depth. I get it. There are several advantages to using a square grid for a tactics game. They are more than traditional, they're the default, having been used by human societies for literal millennia. The Go board features a square grid, even though in Go your focus is on the intersections between the lines, not the actual squares. But then some 1,000 years later we got chess, where the squares are crucial to the movement of the pieces. There's also Ludus Latrum Colorum, Game of Ur, and many others that preceded these and follow them. And there's valid reasons for this squarophilia. It's really easy to draw squares, and rules related to squares are generally simpler to explain and comprehend, since there can only be 4 directions a square can interact with the rest of the board. In the physical world of antiquity, having squares made sense. In the cyber world of the 21st century, having squares doesn't make the same sense. And that is mainly because when it comes to computer games, we don't have to do any of the math related to board interactions in our heads anymore. The computer takes care of all of that crunchy math. I said math. So this not only allows us, the players, the freedom to engage with only the surface level mechanics, but it also allows designers to implement increasingly complex systems within their grid-based games. As such, a hex grid is almost by default not only more tactical in nature for the player, but also offers at least 50% more opportunities for designers to apply their craft. And this is why it truly boggles the mind why the developers at Nival decided to reboot the Hero series with a square grid. Look, I'm sure it made it easier to code for, but at what spirit cost to the series? A series whose main focus was turn-based tactical combat. In fact, I'm pretty sure hex-based tactics were introduced to a large number of current-day gamers through the first 3 Heroes titles. And before you comment, yes, I am aware square grid-based games are still created nowadays, Into the Breach being a great example of a recent one, and this is where I reviewed that one. And I'm also aware of the limitation of the hex grid approach and why it would be much more better if it was an octagonal grid for hyper complex gaming systems. But again, I'm talking about the Hero series here, especially and particularly, not all gaming at large. But if you manage to somehow get past the tactical betrayal, how does combat feel in Heroes 5? Kinda the same, but obviously simpler due to the square grid nature of it. The creature special abilities I mentioned earlier add a thin extra layer of interactability, but overall it is mathematically inferior to the first 3 heroes. It's not bad for what it is, but those special creature abilities would have been even more interesting on a hex grid. So in case you couldn't tell, this was my main issue with the game. My second issue is that the initial Heroes 5 does not come with a map generator and only a small number of standalone scenarios. And again, this is one of the core features of the Heroes series, the ability to either play a developer-designed standalone map or to simply generate a random one once you're done with the campaign. So the lack of this crucial feature is, and was at the time, heavily disappointing. Thankfully, this did get added to the first expansion of the game. But on the other hand, you shouldn't be paying extra for something that should be part of the base package, fuck Ubisoft. And now it's time for Stefan's Miscellaneous Musings. The loading screen. The loading screen features perhaps the busiest clusterfuck of an intro image possible, smashing together as many of the game's units in as small an area as inhumanly conceivable. But by far the thing that always gets my attention is the face of the vampire. There's this blend of complete surprise at what he's doing and total abandon related to him doing it that always makes me chuckle. Like, what the fuck am I doing? But I'm committed, let's do it, The menu screen. If there's one thing that was well made in Heroes 5, then it has to be its menu screen. Mainly because it does a great job at showing you from the onset that this is indeed a fully 3D Heroes game. The video shows a fight between a Haven Priest and an Inferno Archdemon, and I gotta say, it's very cinematic and pretty dynamic. You don't expect the Priest to really stand a fighting chance because the Priest is a 5-tier level Haven creature and the Archdemon is the upgraded level 7 from Inferno. So even in this world, a one-on-one fight would not end nearly as well for the Priest as it's shown in the cinematic, but this is for cool visual points, so
I'll allow it.
Music during enemy turns. During the enemy turns, there's this upbeat, mischievous sort of music playing, as if the enemy is tiptoeing through the tulips and preparing some light-hearted shenanigans, not getting ready to murder your ass. Small details around the map. There's a bunch of very funny small animation touches placed around the maps I did not notice initially, and I am not sure if they were in the game from the beginning either. The mercenary camp, for instance, is surprisingly evocative once you zoom into it, and if you look carefully, you can see an honest-to-goodness cockfight. You heard that right. When you zoom into the farm, you can watch two roosters fighting each other. A cockfight. So now that I've gone through most of what the game is and does, what's my conclusion about Heroes of Might and Magic 5? There is a bit to talk about here, so
Stay a while and listen.
much like with all of the Heroes titles from 3 to 6 at least, I played Heroes 5 pretty close to its release date. Actually, I tried to play it on release, but for whatever reason, the release version they put out did not work at all. Like literally, you could not start the game. And I don't know, I think this was only a Europe thing because I didn't really find a mention of this during my research. But yeah, you had to wait for a couple of days, I think, for like a 700 meg or a 1+ gig patch to actually be able to play the game. I played it for a while. I remember being fairly annoyed by the rather slow AI processing and played the campaign till at a certain point I either couldn't progress any further or a particular fight would overheat and crash my PC. Can't remember for sure. So all in all, the game did not leave a positive impression on me. Since I am human, I obviously went into it this time with the same not so positive impression of it. However, I did go into it with an open mind. I'm glad to see that the game has been patched and lots of things were fixed in the meantime. It is a considerably more stable and smoother experience than I remembered it, and this allowed me to analyze it much more objectively than I would have otherwise. What Heroes 5 had to do in order to be properly successful and accepted by the Heroes playing community at large was to make Heroes 3 and transpose it into a full 3D engine. While it does that in some respects, there are 3 main components that it did not successfully transfer over, as I've described: the world, the combat, and the map generator feature. While the latter would be added in the first expansion, the other 2 remain. And while I can gloss over the world and story aspect, for me personally, it is the shift from a hex grid to a square grid that stops Heroes 5 from being a proper 3D successor to Heroes 3. Is it a bad entry in the series, as some on the internet would have you think? No, not by a long shot. In fact, it's not a bad game at all. The problem is that it wasn't supposed to be just any game at all. This was supposed to be a game in the Heroes of Might and Magic series, and those are some pretty difficult shoes to fill. That being said, I did enjoy my time with it and will continue to play the expansions and review those individually in the future. There is also a rather massive mod for the game called Might and Magic Heroes 5.5, which I may give a look into the future as well. Not to mention the game that the Heroes 5 story feeds into. Hey there, thanks for sticking around. If you enjoyed this video, then please do me a solid and praise the algorithm gods by liking it and writing a comment. For instance, letting me know if you've played Heroes 5 recently and what you thought about it now, not initially. Because like I said in the video, initial impressions, at least for me, did not survive. I've also reviewed Heroes 2, 3, and 4 previously, and you can find them now in the playlist that should be on screen right about now. Checking out my Patreon page would also be highly appreciated if you're in a position to do so. I've been Stefan. Thank you very much for watching, have a great rest of your day, and maybe you'll see me next time.